Dr. Kowinski.
Yes.
I got put in a sling over the weekend, and I am supposed to see the doctor today at like 9:45 to like 10ish, depending on when he gets here. So I'm probably gonna have to log off early, depending on when he texts me when he's here to see me.
That's fine.
Okay, thank you.
Did you get my email over the weekend?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
I just saw it yesterday. Yeah.
I myself am also going to be logging off early.
Perfect.
But the rest of you will stay and you'll leave because you need to get seen to.
Yes.
How's everybody doing? Other than the fact that you hurt yourself. What did you do to yourself?
Well, I've had a torn labrum for like a year, so I'm getting surgery like after season ends, but I landed on it weird, and I think I sprained my AC joint also. So I'm not really sure what's going on with it, but.
Gotcha. Rose, how are you doing?
I'm fine.
Well, amphibians and reptiles will probably start moving soon, so that'll be nice. Normally, I know when things are moving because when I'm out bicycling, I can hear frogs start to call. But I haven't heard anything yet, even though we've had a little bit of a warm up.
We have a really big pond in my backyard, and I was hoping that after this class, I'd be able to identify the different frogs and turtles that we have back there. Yeah,
it wouldn't surprise me if you'd be able to do that. I mean, all the frogs that are around here are pretty recognizable, both by call and by sight. The tricky thing with some of them is actually catching them so that you can see them well enough. Yeah. But once it warms up and things start moving, we'll start going out into the field and doing some field work. So that'll be good. All right, well, it's 9 o'clock, so we should just get started. We're continuing through the next sections of the book that have mainly to do with the biology of amphibians and reptiles. So we've talked about their biogeography. The next thing that we're going to be talking about is their physiological ecology. And so you should be reading the chapter on physiological ecology, which I believe is chapter 6, if I'm recalling correctly. I was just reading through it yesterday. I don't remember the chapter number. But anyway, it deals with two fundamentals that are required for all organisms in maintaining homeostasis, one of which is maintaining appropriate water balance and maintaining a temperature that is within the range of the tolerance of the organism. So I just use this word homeostasis, and we used to talk about homeostasis a lot back when I was an undergraduate, but I don't know the degree to which we talk about this very much nowadays. When I use this term homeostasis, what do you guys think about? How would you define that term?
Like your body's equilibrium point.
Okay, so yeah, it's kind of the body's internal environment and maintaining that environment. Homeostasis is maintaining that environment in a relatively constant state. And amphibians and reptiles are interesting from this standpoint because they're ectotherms. We used to think that they didn't maintain their internal environment at a very constant state. But what we've discovered through studying them intensively is that they're actually, in many cases, quite good at maintaining what we call a homeostasis. Homeostasis, the very word itself means maintaining the constancy. And so then the question becomes for physiological ecologists, well, how do organisms go about doing this? Especially from the standpoint of temperature, when you can't generate metabolic heat, how do you maintain your body temperature within a range that allows you to function physiologically? And then there's the issue of having enough water, and in some cases, dealing with too much water, depending on what type of environment that you live in. So the chapter begins with water relations and then goes into temperature relations. So we'll talk about water today and probably part of the time on Wednesday. And then on Wednesday, I want to introduce temperature relations by having you read Coles and Bogart's 1944 paper on thermoregulation in desert lizards. It's up on the Moodle site. You do not have to write a literature summary of it, but you need to read it and be prepared to discuss it on Wednesday. And then we'll use that as a jumping off point for talking about thermoregulation in amphibians and reptiles on Friday. The reason that I want you to read the Coles and Bogart paper is because it's kind of a historically important paper. It's kind of the first paper where biologists were in a very careful and systematic way looking at reptiles in this case as something other than just a taxonomic curiosity. They really were interested in the details of their biology, and it marks, I made a note of this when we were going through history, kind of marks this turning point in herpetology where the field of herpetology shifted from the field of study that is focused on naming and describing species to a field of study that was focused on thinking about these organisms as organisms and having a biology and ecology. So it's an important paper for both of those reasons. Now, what you're going to find is it's also written very differently than the way we write papers nowadays. It's written in a very 1944 way, but it's easy enough to understand. So that's the plan for the next week. And we'll still be talking about temperature relations into the beginning of next week. So, water relations. The water content of organisms varies, and so the water content of reptiles is slightly lower than the water content of amphibians, and that shouldn't really surprise you all that much, given the fact that there are large portions of the body of reptiles that are designed to prevent water loss. And as a result, those parts of the body of the reptile are going to be drier than, for example, the skin of reptiles is going to be drier than the skin of amphibians. And as a result, that's dry mass rather than wet mass.
Paul, are you wanting us to see your PowerPoint?
I am. Are you not?
I'm not.
Okay. All right. Let me try that again. How about now?
Yeah, now I can.
Okay.
Thanks.
So in all cases, you have to gain water. You have to balance water gain versus water loss. In our organisms that we talk about, we can think of water being gained via three different avenues. You can just get liquid water like drinking, which is how we would do it. But then we also get water through what we call preformed water. Preformed water is water that is found in your food, and we also get water that way. So for example, if you're drinking something really dry, like a really dry sandwich or something, you'll wash that down with liquid water, and in the process of doing that, you're getting water gain. But then if you're eating something like grapes or oranges and things like that, there's water inherent in those foods, and so you also get water gain from that. And amphibians and reptiles are the same way. But then reptiles and amphibians will, in many cases, gain water through metabolic water production, which is not a mechanism by which we typically gain water. It's water that is gained by either breaking down carbohydrates or lipids or proteins, and the process of metabolizing those things produces water. And in some cases, reptiles in particular will actually store fat. And one of the reasons that they store fat is that they live in drought-stricken areas, places that are prone to seasonal drought. And during these droughty periods, they will actually metabolize that fat in order to produce water. And so they're not storing that fat because they need energy, they're actually storing that fat because they need water. So we'll look at some examples of that. So there's a certain degree to which getting access to water is behavioral in amphibians and reptiles. And so we think of these animals as having what we call water postures, postures that are designed to help the animal harvest water. So this is Crotalus cucullatus, one of the rattlesnakes in the desert Southwest. This is its normal alert ambush posture. It's basically got the front part of the body sitting on top of the coils. The neck is drawn into a serpentine S-shaped posture here, and it's ready to strike any small mammal that might come walking by, as opposed to the rain collecting posture, where you can see that the animal has flattened its body. Its neck is still in a serpentine shape, although not as radically serpentine as it is in the ambush posture. But you can also see that the head, rather than sitting up on top of the coils, the head is directed down into the coils. And what it's basically doing is it's making a dish out of its body in order to gather rainfall, and then that channels it to the mouth, and then the animal will actually drink from the pools of water that form within the different rings of the skin as this thing is coiled up. And so this is one type of water posture that an animal will take on when it's raining in order to collect water before that water goes into this gravelly substrate that it lives on, and just basically percolates through the soil and is lost and no longer available to the animal. We also see water postures in Molochordus and Phrynosoma Corneutium. Molochordus is a species that lives in Western Australia, and Phrynosoma Corneutium is a species that lives in the desert southwest of the United States. It turns out that these two organisms have a lot of convergent characteristics that makes them very similar, even though Molochordus is an agamid lizard and Phrynosoma Corneutium is a phrynosomatid lizard. So they're two lizards in different families located on different sides of the world, but they have a lot of similarities. Both of them are very spiny. You have the large horns on the head of the horned lizard, and then these large fringe scales that make it very spiny. And then you can see that there are spines all over the body of Molochordus. The common name for Molochordus is the thorny devil. And then these are, of course, the horned lizards of the desert Southwest. They're both ant specialists, and so they are ambush predators that prey on ants. And they don't really move that much. They basically get by using crypsis, and when they are detected, they also then get by being difficult to handle because they are thorny or horny, depending on the two species. But another way in which they share similarity is that they live in desert environments, and as a result, they are challenged by being able to get enough water. And so they have scale structures that allow them to transmit water, in this case from the feet of the thorny devil and from the feet and body of the horned lizard. They have these water channeling structures built into the design of their scales. And these structures are basically like little thin tubes, and so they basically act like capillary tubes. And so if you look at the scalation of these guys, you see that there are little channels that go between the scales. And when you look at the scales in some detail, the scales are relatively tightly connected, but down at the bottom, at the base of the scales, down in the skin, you see that the scales create these little tubes. And if you've ever worked with capillary tubes, you know that these small diameter tubes, they basically wick moisture up into the tube because of the small diameter of it and the surface tension of water. And so this is what those tubes look like microscopically. This is one scale. Here's another scale. And then these little pockets on the edges here essentially act as capillary tubes. Here's one of them blown up. And then these capillary tubes basically transmit water from the back end of the animal up to the mouth. And then there's some modified scales around the mouth that then channel that liquid into the mouth of the lizard. So they can basically just find a small puddle of water and stand in that puddle of water, and it will wick the water up into these little capillary tube-like structures and transmit water to the mouth. So that even if it's in a little film of water that is too small to effectively drink out of, they can still get access to it. In addition, if it ever rains on them or dews on them, it will also transmit that water to their mouth as well. So that's kind of interesting thing with these two convergently evolved organisms that are even convergent down to these water gathering structures. Questions about that? There's an example of Conyxis. Conyxis are a group of African tortoises. They're called the dorsal hinged tortoises. Most tortoises and turtles, if they have a hinge in their carapace or plastron at all, it's in the plastron, which is this ventral surface of the animal. So for example, in the box turtle here in North America, here in Missouri, there's a single hinge in the plastron that can hinge the two parts of the plastron up and close itself in. It's more common that hinges are found on the plastron, but in this one particular genus of tortoises, the members of the genus Conyxis have a dorsal hinge that is back here. They can actually kind of pull their back end down and pull their feet up and get some protection. But from a water perspective, what's interesting about these animals is that their marginal scutes, these marginal scales going around the edge of the carapace, they're upturned such that they essentially form kind of a water gutter. And this water gutter will direct water to the front end of the animal when the animal raises its hind legs. And then the animal will also, when it's raining, project its front legs out, and essentially it will channel water down to, once again, the mouth of the animal. So this is not a morphological adaptation, but another behavioral adaptation to assist with the water gain. These things live in equatorial Africa, so they live in rainforests. But one of the things about rainforests is oftentimes the soil will just soak up the water, and there aren't standing pools of water in many cases. So these guys channel water to their mouth as it falls on them. A friend of mine named Dwight Lawson, who's now director at the Oklahoma City Zoo, when we were in graduate school together, he worked in Cameroon, and he brought back a series of Conyxis tortoises alive. And when he brought them back, he was farming them out to other graduate students to take care of them. And so me and my wife at the time had one of these animals that crawled around our apartment while we were in graduate school, which is why I know something about Conyxis, and was surprised to find them as an example in your textbook when I started teaching this class. Rosie was her name. She eventually died. Sadness. So that's liquid water gain. So this is the first of these ways. The next way in which you can get water is through preformed water, which is water found in food. One of the examples that they mention in your book is the chuckwalla. The chuckwalla is a large, heavy-set lizard that lives in the desert Southwest. If you go out to southern Arizona, it's a pretty common lizard. And then if you continue going west, they extend all the way into Baja California. These guys are seasonal in terms of their eating habits. The water content of food varies seasonally, and so it varies from 72% water content in the spring to 51% water content in the summer. And so these chuckwallas get a lot of their food they get a lot of their water from their food. And as a result of that, once the water content of the food falls below a certain level, they basically just stop eating it. And the reason that they stop eating it is that when you're eating really dry food, when it goes into your gut, because of the diffusion of water, because of osmosis, if you're eating dry food and you're already water stressed, the food itself will draw water out of your body. And so you don't want to eat water that is too dry at a time when you are attempting to conserve water. And so they go through long periods of time during the summer where they basically just fast, essentially. These guys are herbivorous, and you'll also notice that this animal has a very thick tail. So this is one of those species that actually stores fat in its tail and can use metabolism of fat to produce water as well. This is one of the darker morphs of Ceramalis obesis, but they come in a variety of different colors. Some of them are more brick red in body color, but they're all members of the same species. This is an interesting study, once again, done by a friend of mine. This was actually his dissertation research, which is weird because he graduated back in the 1990s, but it didn't get published until 2015. It took him forever to get this published. But this guy, Brian Jennings, he's now in Brazil. He teaches at a university in Brazil. He studied desert tortoises, this tortoise that lives in the desert Southwest. And what he did was he followed tortoises around. So I think this study is based on 18 tortoises. And he would locate a tortoise, and then he would just follow that tortoise for days on end. And what he would do is he would look at what the tortoise was eating. And so he would actually count the number of bites that the tortoise took out of different plant species. And then after he had tracked this tortoise through the desert, he would then go back and every 5 meters, he would put down a little frame, a little PVC frame, and then he would count all of the species that occur along the path of this desert tortoise. And what he would look at is he would look at what's the distribution of plants in the area where the tortoise was living, which is the black bars. And then he would look at what the tortoise was actually eating, which is the open bars. And what he found was that the tortoises tended to eat things that really were not very common in the environment at all. And in some cases, the tortoises were eating things that didn't appear in any of the plant transects that he put down. And so what he found was that these tortoises are really, really selective. And in this case, this is a little flowering plant, but in many cases, especially when you look at the perennial, so this is a plot of the annual species that they were feeding on, and this is a plot of the perennial species that they were feeding on. And he found that especially among the perennials, that they were eating a lot of succulents, which obviously are going to be a good source of water, and they're eating a lot of proteinaceous plants. So this is a legume in the family Fabaceae, which is one of the nitrogen-fixing plants, and they happen to be plants that are high in protein. So what he found was that in all periods of springtime, which is when they predominantly eat, they're either eating certain plants that they're feeding on, primarily the floral parts of the plant, which is a good source of carbohydrates, or they're feeding on succulents, which are a good source of water, or legumes, which are a good source of protein. And once again, this is later on in the spring, once again, looking at annual plants. Once again, this is a more succulent type of plant, which is being fed on heavily late into the spring. And then once again, we have these same two species that are preferred, one of which is a succulent, the other of which is a legume. So these tortoises know their environment pretty well, and they forage in a way that indicates that they are getting a certain amount of their water from their diet, from this preformed water in their food, because they're concentrating on animals that are high, or concentrating on plants that are high in water content. And then the last way in which you can get water is basically by doing metabolism and then gaining water from the substances that you are metabolizing. The best way to do this is by metabolizing fat. You get way more water out of a gram of fat than you get out of a gram of starch or a gram of protein. But the amount of water that you get out of protein varies depending on whether you're metabolizing protein in a way that it produces urea or in a way that produces uric acid. This figure down here is the chemical compound for urea, and this is uric acid. You don't need to know those, they're just there for reference. But one of the things that you do know about the difference between urea and uric acid is uric acid is dry. And so when you see a bird poop on your car, you will oftentimes see a brownish portion of the poop, which is the leftover food, and then you'll also see a whitish portion. That whitish portion is uric acid, and when you look at it, it's chalky or powdery, actually, or crystalline if you were to put it in your fingers and feel it. And it's because it's had all of the water drawn out of it. And so when you're metabolizing protein and forming uric acid, that turns out to be a much drier way of getting rid of nitrogenous waste than urea, which is liquid. It's much more dilute. And as a result, you get less water if you're excreting urea than if you're excreting uric acid. But in all cases, you get way more water from metabolizing fat. Questions about those three forms of water gain: liquid water, preformed water, and metabolic water. So those are all ways in which you gain water. So then the other thing that you can do as an animal is you can try and avoid losing water as much as possible. And so you can lose water through two primary ways, one of which is through evaporation. And evaporation can take on a number of forms. You can lose evaporation through the skin. You can lose water through evaporation by breathing. And then you also lose water as you're getting rid of nitrogenous waste. So all of your nitrogenous waste are excreted, are processed by the kidney and then excreted via the bladder, and either come out as urea or uric acid. And once again, if you're excreting urea, you're diluting that with a lot of water. If you're excreting uric acid, you are not. And so one form requires more water than the other. So the skin, evaporation across skin is very important. And we've talked about the importance of scales in reptiles as one adaptation to avoid water loss. So we can look at skin resistance. It's the time that it takes water to diffuse through the skin. For amphibians, it varies quite a lot. So for amphibians in general, it's pretty fast, but there are some groups that it's much slower. And so we have arboreal hylid frogs, the tree frogs, arachophorids that have a slower skin resistance or a higher level of skin resistance, meaning water goes through the skin less quickly. And then in these Chiromantis and Phylomedusa frogs, these are called the wax frogs. It's very slow. The movement of water across the skin is very slow. And then when you move from amphibians in general to reptiles, this skin resistance goes up to over 1,000. And so when you look at the skin, you can see that in amphibians, there's a stratum corneum at the top, a very thin stratum corneum, that is basically the dead cells at the top, just like your skin is, except your skin is much thicker in terms of stratum corneum. And then you have these mucus glands, and this watery mucus is designed to prevent water loss to a certain degree, but because it's mucus, it has a certain amount of evaporation of water loss leaving the skin, diffusing through the mucus and then evaporating off the surface. Waxy frogs, rather than having mucus glands, they have lipid glands, and they basically secrete this waxy substance, and your book talks about it's a mixture of a variety of things, but it ends up giving them this waxy sort of feel to them. And then rather than being coated in a layer of watery mucus, it's coated in a layer of lipid, and lipids are much less prone to water moving through it. And then, of course, when we get to the squamates, the lizards and snakes, you actually have thick layers of stratum corneum, and you have two layers of this. You have an outer generation and an inner generation that we talked about when we were looking at skin in general. So you have very thick, very water impermeable epidermis, partly because the layers of the stratum corneum are thicker, and partly because the overall epidermis is thicker and that it has these two duplicate layers. The outer layer will ultimately be shed. The inner generation will become the outer generation, and a new layer of inner generation will be generated from the stratum terminativum at the bottom here. So we'll finish up with just looking at the behavior of Phylomedusa. This is one of the waxy frogs, and as you can see, what this animal is doing is bending its legs back in strange ways, such that it's taking the secretions from these wax glands and spreading it all over the body. It will do that with the rear feet, and it will do that with the forelimbs as well. And it's basically spreading the wax all over the body surface to essentially create this lipid layer that will then prevent the animal from desiccating quite so easily. And it also gives them this kind of shiny, but also kind of a dull shine sort of appearance, kind of like what you would see a candle looking like. And when you pick them up and feel them, they actually feel tougher to the touch because they have this waxy coating on them. And so that's one type of adaptation amphibians use to avoid water loss. Questions? All right, well, for a couple of years now, I've been pausing at mid-semester to kind of do an assessment with students. This is an assessment that somebody told me, well, actually, Dr. Diltz told me about this, that they use at James Madison University, where you have another faculty member come in and talk to students about the class. And then the purpose of this is that the professor then knows kind of what's working in the class, what's not working in the class, and can kind of alter the way the class is taught to facilitate learning throughout the rest of the semester. So you normally try and do this at around mid-semester. And so you should have gotten an email over the weekend, should have gotten an email yesterday with a link to a Zoom meeting. So here in a few minutes, Dr. Diltz will join you. I'm going to log off. You need to log on to her Zoom meeting, and she will have a conversation with you about how you think her pathology is going. Do you have any questions about anything? All right, so read the paper for Wednesday. We're going to start on Wednesday talking about, once again, water relations, but as soon as we're done with that, we'll go into reading talking about the Coles and Bogart paper, and then that'll introduce us to thinking about thermoregulation. And I will see you guys on Wednesday.